Hello everybody, JGC Anime here, and today we are going to be reviewing Ranking of Kings, or Asalma rankings. So, yeah, let's just hop right into this. So, what is Ranking of Kings? The story follows a young boy, well technically young, he is an older brother, so I don't remember his actual age, but we follow the boy Boji, who is a boy where despite, he's a prince, and he wants to be king, however he has like two issues. One, that he is deaf, and the other is that he cannot speak. So he has to rely on stuff like sign language and can't really normally interact with others the same way they can interact with him. And he wants to be king. However, after his brother, his younger brother, Daida, ends up being crowned king because people believe he would be a better king in terms of like what he can do since he can speak and hear. Boji goes out on a journey to try to train himself to become a better king. Like, he wants to be a king, so he wants to grow his strength. And a lot of different escapades ensue, and yeah, that's all I can really say without spoiling too much. So let's just hop into what I like and dislike. So, as crazy as it sounds, I think the writing in this show is actually phenomenal. Like, it amazes me how well written this show is. Normally, when I watch a show, there's like a few plot holes here and there where I think, but that could be explained better, or this could be explained more well. But no, this show did a phenomenal job with how it handled things. When I was watching, I didn't feel like there were almost any massive plot hole-like elements. And the only one I could think of isn't even really a plot hole as much as a thing that could be explained in a future season if they ever made one. Although the story is so well written that even if you did watch it in this one season is enough to tell the whole story. If there was any more, it'd just be like an additional bonus thing, I guess you could say. But this season on its own just crammed everything so well together that I absolutely loved it. As for some things I might dislike, I can't really think of much other than like these like 6 villains that come in later down the line that I can talk about in the spoiler section. I don't think there were any massive issues with this series that I disliked. I thought most of the characters were very well written, and there weren't any I could say I really hated. I think that pretty much the majority of them were very well written and characters I really enjoyed watching, especially Boji, along with his best friend in this story, Kage, who I can also talk about later on. But I can't think of anything I really hate about this series. It was fantastic in almost every way. And the only thing I can say is that I didn't enjoy it as much going later on, and not because the story was bad. I can explain that in a moment. In fact, let's explain right now. So the reason I don't think I enjoyed this as much as I normally would have is probably due to the fact of how I watched it. You see, I watched this show in its English dub. However, I watch dubs sometimes. Not all the time. In fact, I have been leaning more towards subs, but I do watch dubs from time to time for shows I'm not sure if I would like or not. When I was watching this dubbed, 7 episodes when I first started watching it had only come out at the time. And so when not season 2, I was about to say season 2 for some reason. When part 2 was being released, I say part 2, but I'm pretty sure it was just a full 23 episode run. I ended up having to wait. I decided to hold off until the entire series was finished before I continued. And because I decided to do so, I ended up not watching it because, again, only 7 episodes were released at the time. I had to wait way too many weeks for the rest of the series to finish. And thus, by the time it was finally ready for me to continue watching, I ended up deciding to pick up right where I left off rather than going back and rewatching the first 7 episodes that I had seen beforehand, and thus the impact of how important this whole story was did not feel as emotional. I'm sure if I went back and rewatched the whole thing one line through, like just straight through to the end, I'd love it. It'd be one of my favorite shows of all time. The only reason it's not is because of the fact that I myself took so long to get back into this that even when I returned, I wasn't able to fully embrace it. But I did still enjoy a lot of the characters in the story. There were a few things I was a bit unsure about how they designed it, such as characters dying but then not dying or something else like that, but I can talk about that again later in the spoiler section. But I still had a very good time with this story, and I think that it was just really well written. I can't say there were any real issues with it, and that's why I I'm struggling to really come up with anything to talk about. So let's just hop into the spoiler section of this video. So here's a timestamp to when the spoiler section ends. I don't know how long the spoiler section is going to be, but I do have a lot to talk about. So yeah, I'm just going to count up from 5. We're going to enter the spoiler section. If you have seen Ranking of Kings, I'd recommend sticking around to hear my spoiler thoughts. However, if you haven't, I'd recommend skipping to the end because, you know, you don't want to be spoiled. So yeah, without further ado, let's just count up from 5 and enter the spoiler section. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so when I described 6 characters I really didn't like at the end, they were the 6 villains or so, I think it was like 6 villains, that the main antagonist brought in at the end of the story. I believe her name is Miranjo. I'm pretty sure that's the name. I don't know why I forgot it for a second, but it's Miranjo, I believe that's how it's pronounced. Where she brings in characters that, I believe one was called King Bo. There were a few others. That they're like these criminals of some underworld place that was being run by a guy called Deshir, who was the brother to the person who ends up training Bojji down the line, Despa. And the prisoners escape, so they're going to go get them back. And they're like the main antagonists in a way. No, they're not main antagonists. They're not main antagonists at all. They are very much kind of unnecessary, if I'm being honest. They only really exist to kind of show off just how dangerous both the heroes and villains are. Like how Bojji is revealed to be the son of a giant, since, you know, his father, Boss, is a giant, and his mother was also a giant. Thus, he has a very powerful immune system. So they had to show that off by having some guy breathe poison into his face, but it didn't affect him at all. It's just this whole thing where they kind of only exist to show off how strong both the heroes and the villains of this story are. And I'm fine with that, but they felt very unnecessary. The only one of the villains that showed up that felt like they had any sort of like play in the story, other than the character Gigan, who after just being defeated by Bojji once, just like, okay, I'm gonna serve you now. The only other person besides him who really plays any type of role at all is the character Oaken, who is revealed to be, you know, the brother, another one of the brothers of Despa and Deshir. And those two are the only ones that really play any role. The rest of them are literally just exist to be helpful plot threads, such as one of the other villains whose name I can't remember, literally only exists to be possessed by Miranjo to use healing magic. That is all they're used for throughout the entire story. That's all they're used for in the whole thing. And just, I feel like if you just brought in the main villains along with King Bo, who is, I believe that's his name, they were the only really required characters. I could tell why they were brought in, at least most of them, but for a majority, I didn't think they were necessary, but eh. There was also this weird thing in like the first few episodes where I thought they were meant to be treating it like an actual political thing where characters try to kill off other characters, because in the first 7 episodes that I watched, one of the characters known as Bebin was taken out early on, and I thought, oh, he's dead. Wow, I was not expecting that. This must be an actual show that takes serious risks. And then later on, they're just like, yeah, no, he's fine. He's fine. Just like there's this consistent thing where they just cannot decide what they are trying to do with, like, do they want everyone to live? Do they want everyone to die? But it's in the end, they chose everyone to live, so that happened. Well, besides some people. Miranjo dies for a little bit before coming back, and Daitis decides to protect her by asking for her hand in marriage. But I can talk about Miranjo in a bit. Boss returns for a bit, like Boss, Bojji and Daida's father. He gets revived because he's killed at the beginning of the series, and he gets revived by possessing the body of his son Daida. And it's actually kind of interesting at the start, I think, because at the start he says, oh, I took something from my son again, didn't I? And when he did that, I thought, maybe this is like the 10th, 12th, maybe 100th time he's done this. Maybe he's revived himself multiple times through his children. But then it's like, nah, he took his first, he took Boji's main strength, and he took Daida's body, which it's fine. I think that was a very good idea with developing that forward, but I felt like my idea of him constantly possessing his sons would have been a lot more interesting. But again, you can't win everything. Still though, I don't think there were any massive issues, because as I mentioned before, most of the plot threads in this show are resolved. I also like how sometimes they make you think you hate a character, but then you end up really liking them by the end. Like, when we first were introduced to the story, we were introduced to the character Hilling, who is Boji's stepmother and Daida's mother. And when I first saw her, I thought she was literally just going to be a complete jerk who always looked down on Boji. But then it's quickly revealed, no, she actually cares about him a lot. Way more than you think she does. And it's such a nice thing seeing her care about him that honestly, she was one of my favorite characters by the end of the story. And it's crazy because it makes you like characters way more than you thought you would. There's also one thing I have to say that I love about this series is how it doesn't try to go into like hardcore detail about characters' backstories. When I was watching, I was expecting a whole episode on Moranjo's backstory. I was expecting like this huge, highly detailed, way too focused, developed story because I've been watching a lot of One Piece. So they want to stretch out the story as much as they can, so they go for like 30 episode backstories. But no, this one didn't even really go into that. Whenever I tried to go over a backstory for a character, it wasn't like heavily detailed. It was just kind of glimpses in the past discussing things about them, and I honestly appreciated that a lot because it let us stay focused on the story because we didn't have to give so much attention to having to show these characters' pasts. Even characters I thought I wouldn't even recognize or think about ended up getting some attention. As I mentioned before, Gigan is a monster who was sealed away after turning on the people who hired him because he didn't want to keep seeing his people get slaughtered. He ends up seeing Boji's strength and claims to be his knight of some kind. He got knighted by Boji, I believe. However, or he's just one of his servants now. However, that ends up quickly getting taken care of and removed because Gigan ends up going back to the underworld place that Boji went to train. Literally just to be like, it's like, I'm gonna serve you, but then I'm not because I'm gonna go back down there now. So yeah, there's also this other character called Dorsha who I didn't even think about at all. I thought he was just a side character who didn't do anything, but no, literally every single character other than like the last 6 who were introduced in the later episodes all have developments of some kind, whether it's heavy development or simple little glimpses into their past and who they are as characters. It is such an appreciated thing because I get to get an idea of who they are, and instead of trying to force it all down my throat, making me think, oh, I have to know this character's everything. No, I don't. They just give me little glimpses and let me put the picture together from there. And I really appreciate that because it's really annoying when they dedicate entire storylines literally just to talk about this one specific thing. And I really like how they just let me figure things out because it's not like one of those stories where you have to know what's going on in order to understand. Most of these backstories and stuff aren't incredibly necessary. A majority of them are just there. And it's so much better when they are like maybe 5 to 6 minutes of the episode rather than being the full 24 minutes. There are also some really good fights in this series. That's probably due to the fact that it has cheap art style in a way where the art style is so simple, it's so easy to draw that it's easy to animate. And yet it still feels so good because you see the fluid animation just looks so nice. And just there were so many awesome fights in this story. One of my favorites definitely has to be like the final fight between Boss and Boji, where Boss tries to fight Boji, and during that fight, since Boji imagines he's fighting his father, that's the way they visualize it in the story. They have us see it as if Boss is fighting Boji, not Daidas, who's Boss's body. The Boss is possessing Daidas's body. We see Boss, we don't see Daidas, and it honestly just... It feels so nice because it just feels like it comes around full circle where one thinks they're the strongest, but then the other's the strongest. It's this nice development, and other than like this last plot thread with the character Oaken, who's like an immortal who can't die, his head gets tossed in the ocean, gets eaten by a fish, a giant fish, and the rest of his body just kind of lies there. That's a plot thread that I'm sure could be resolved at one point, but I still think it kind of wrapped it up in a way. Overall, though, I think the story did a great job, and definitely has a lot of respect for me, especially with how it ended. Like, it ended where Bojji was going to become king. In fact, he was even crowned king. However, after he realized his best friend Kage, who was part of some clan called the Shadow Clan, who honestly had one of my, even though that episode had a lot of backstory, like when I went over Kage's backstory, it was really emotional. It was a really good backstory. Kage realized, what does a shadow thief like me, like, 'cause he was a thief, so, you know, 'cause he's part of the Shadow Clan, but he's a thief. He's like, what would I have to do around a guy like Bojji, who is just so innocent and pure? And so he thought, yeah, I'm just gonna dip. I'm sure he'll be fine. But of course, neither of them actually wants to leave the other. So Bojji decides, rather than having to focus now that because he wanted to be king, because he didn't want to lose his friend, he decided rather than being king, he was going to instead join Kage out in the wild and, like his father, make a kingdom of his own, which I think is honestly a perfect goal now that he's accomplished being king at one point. Unlike some characters where I feel like, I just feel annoyed when they suddenly switch their goals, I actually really like this goal, since Bojji has completed his goal, so he has a new one, and this new goal makes a lot of sense. It doesn't feel like an out-of-nowhere goal that doesn't feel necessary. It feels like a goal that honestly sounds like something Bojji would want to do. And I really respect it. This series never had any massive flaws. Were there things I felt were unnecessary? Yes. Were there moments that I wish there could have been a better explanation for things? Yes. But overall, there were so few flaws that it was really good. It was just really good. I just wish that I didn't feel bored sometimes watching it because I didn't understand what was going on as well as I could have if I just gone back and rewatched the first 7 episodes that I never went back and rewatched. Maybe if I do ever watch it with a friend, I'll rewatch the whole thing with them, and I'll probably love it once I do. So yeah, we're at the conclusion of this video, and what are my final thoughts? It's honestly a very good series. Even if myself has a few problems, like even if I have a few problems with it, I still liked it a lot, and I would recommend it to someone who just really likes an awesome fantasy story. All in all, I definitely would have to give this series a solid 9 out of 10. Even if I ran into a few issues while watching it, I can guarantee you that if someone loves fantasy, loves the idea of a protagonist overcoming struggles, this is definitely the show for you. And that's all I really have to say. Thank you all for watching. If you're new to the JGC Anime channel, don't forget to subscribe. I always welcome new anime fans to the channel. And I will see you all around. Peace!